Um, so much to talk about right now. About today. I guess I'll start briefly with karate. That went well. She was the tiniest one in the class. Um, it's a 4 to 8 year old class, and I think there was like one other 4 year old. So they have classes on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and Wednesdays even. I think maybe anyway a bunch of days for 4 to 8 year olds. So I think it's a real mix of who she could be with at any given class. So today's class, it was she can go to any class whenever she wants. She doesn't have to stick to a set day. So this isn't a set class. Anyway, she was the smallest one, and she's never had any kind of instruction before or organized sports or anything like that. So she was definitely a little slow to grasp what was expected, but they were really nice to her, and she did do stuff, like she would eventually get it, and some things she did get on her own without having to have special attention. And then when it was over, she didn't want to leave, so she really enjoyed it. So that's good. And the sensei was had a good attitude, and he wasn't the same guy that we interviewed with last week. So anyway, I've had a better feeling about it, and as long as Poppy's into it, then I'm into it. So then we went to. I may have filled you in a little bit that this aunt of mine contacted me on Facebook, and she lives in Rocky Point, which is a small world, crazy coincidence. So, oh, that's you texting me. I mean, one of my audience members. Um, um, I just read the text. Focus, focus. Um, okay, this is Aunt Josephine. Aunt Josephine was married to my mother's brother, whose name was Jack. And they were always married, but he died about 15 years ago. So, um, and they lived in Brooklyn for many, many years, their whole lives. And she's got 6 kids, my first cousins, and I only met these cousins like once or twice in my life. Um, God, I'm so tired, and I don't know how much detail to give or leave out. But okay, there's a lot of reminiscing, and I won't get into any of that. Just pleasant, like how she wanted to know how me and my siblings were doing, and she filled us in on how all her children were doing, and that was nice. It took a while. A big chunk of the day was talking about that stuff. Um, but Carolyn and I both had an agenda, which was to find out as much as we possibly could about my mother's mother, my grandmother, which would also have been her husband's mother. So my grandmother was her mother-in-law. Um, so because my mother was completely estranged from her mother, and she never ever talked about her mother at all. And all of us kids, just each and every one of us had this vibe of like, don't ask mom about her mother. And I know I personally, from a very, very young age, assumed that my mother's mother must have died, and it was too painful for her to talk about. Because she would talk about her grandmother. Basically, she was raised by her grandmother and her father. So we didn't know anything. And then on my mother's deathbed, pretty much, this woman named Jeannie came to visit, and my mother was really sick, and so she was talking to me in private, and she was very emotional and was like, your mother showed me the only kindness I ever knew when I was growing up, and that I wouldn't be where I am today without the kindness that your mother showed me and my brothers. She was so vital to our lives, and she was wonderful, and we love her. Um, she was almost like our mother. Okay, so then she visits with my mother and they chat and catch up, and then she goes home, and I talk to my mom. I'm like, who is Jeannie? Like, you've never talked about her, and she said that you were like her savior. And my mother started crying, and then it all came tumbling out that okay, her mother, my grandmother, was an alcoholic and um, abandoned my mother and my mother's brothers and my grandfather, abandoned them to shack up with this other guy. And this is in 1930s Brooklyn, in Park Slope, which was at that time a totally Irish Catholic tight knit community, like basically a small town. So this woman, my mother's mother, just like abandoned the family, moves in, doesn't get divorced, moves in with this other guy named Mr. Reynolds, and proceeds to have 4 children, staying in the neighborhood. She just like moved into an apartment in the neighborhood, and this was like a shocking, unbelievable scandal in the neighborhood, and people would say vicious things. There was vicious gossip. It was like the hot gossip of their time, and um, so my grandmother continued. She was just a drunken person, and she was neglecting these 4 children. One of them was Jeannie, who came to visit us. And so my mother was a teenager when these kids were being born and growing up. And so she felt so bad for them that they were being neglected by their mother that she would go and take care of them. She would take them out for walks. She would do all kinds of things for them, and show them love and care. And their mother was incapable of it. And then, so my mother tells us this, and it was like mind blowing. And then, so then like that night, my father was like, "Tell me more." Like what? And I remember him telling me that um, they at my mother and father's wedding that this my mother's mother showed up uninvited, I think, unexpected, and drunk and made a scene. And then another thing that happened was that my parents got married, and then they had Danny, and then they had Carol Ann. They were living in their little house in Brooklyn, and Grandma started showing up unannounced and drunk, and my mother snapped and said, "We have to move," and they decided to move to Staten Island because it would be hard for this grandma to reach them on Staten Island. Having to cross a bridge, I'm sure she didn't drive, so it would be effectively cut her off from Grandma, her mother. And um, so they did it. My father was supportive of her desire to do that, and he moved to Staten Island. And I don't know if she ever saw her again. Okay, so that's all I knew from 20 plus years ago. Like, and oh, and I guess my mother would have her little half siblings. Like she would have them in a baby carriage, like going down the street, and people would shout, "Your mother's a whore. Your mother, oh, you're taking your mother's bastard children out for a walk," like horrible things. So okay, so my mom got to a point of like cutting off contact and just never speaking of her ever, ever, ever. But meanwhile, she was my mother's brothers stayed in Brooklyn, had kids, and Grandma was in their kids' lives. Okay, so we get to Josephine's today, and eventually I was able to be like, "Can you tell me anything about?" Because she was mentioning a couple of times she said my mother-in-law, and so at some point I had a moment to be like, "Tell me, we don't know anything about her. Like, you share anything about her?" And she's like, I loved her. She was a wonderful mother-in-law, and she was great with my children. And it's really sad what happened with your mother. Like, and I'm gonna wrap this up. Basically, um, so apparently, my grandmother got sober at some point and became this wonderful mother-in-law and grandmother. And toward the end of her life, she was in a nursing home in the early 90s. And Josephine said that when she learned that my mother was very, very ill, that she prayed for her constantly. And then Josephine said, she's like, when your mother died, that was the end for Josephine. She started like not remembering things, going into dementia, and she didn't live very long. And before that, when your mother was ill, she would pray for her constantly. So it's fucking with my mind. Like, oh, and Josephine was like, we were like, well, if she, why did my mother like cut her off so totally? And Josephine was like, I think she was scared of her mother. Uh, Things were really, really bad when she was young. I guess she was, when my mother's parents first separated, my mother lived with my mother lived with her mother, and I guess there was total neglect, and so my mother's father like got her and took her to live with his mother, and so she had to be rescued. So there's obviously trauma and all the shame and horror of like the scandal stuff, and then the drunken unpredictability of her behavior when my mother was an adult and trying to raise her family. So I can kind of see it. I do see it, but then how come for these other people in the family, she was a great grandmother and a great mother-in-law, and like for my mother's brothers, she was. I mean, it's understandable that people get sober and they find Jesus or whatever, and they like turn their lives around. So I can even believe that, but I don't know that my mother never forgave her, and my mother was not vindictive and petty, and she didn't hold grudges, but she absolutely permanently cut her off. And Josephine told me that at one point, like in the late 1980s, there was some family event, like a wedding or something, that my mother and father were supposed to go to. My mother decided not to go, and that my father was like, "Oh, come on," because her mother was going to be at the event, and that my father was like, "Oh, come on now, like she's an old woman, like what are you afraid of?" So there's fear there, and but also steely determination to keep her out of our lives and us not to ever know her. But I feel sad because I never had a grandmother, and I have a picture of her now. I took a picture of a photograph, and I just keep staring at it. And she looks like my mom. She looks like an old version of my mom, and it's very haunting to me. Um, and there's other things. Like Josephine was like kind of almost making me cry. She was like, "I was so close with your mother. I loved her so much." She's Irish. I mean, my aunt's Irish. That's why I'm speaking that way. But she's like, the day before her wedding, I helped her shop for nightgowns and clothes for her honeymoon, and oh, we had such a grand time, and she was just a lovely person, and I was so sad when she died, and I'm so sorry you lost your mother. Like just she was so sweet, and she said, um, I was like, it's a shame that they were never able to reunite and patch it up, and she said, oh, but they're together in heaven now, so that's very sweet, and I hope it's true. Thank you.